When we think about climate change and climate action, certainly in the past, there has been a tendency to see the solution on the supply side. Build more green stuff, right? Whether it's renewable energy capacity or electric vehicles or low carbon cement, the focus of the world to some extent has been on how can we ramp up the production, the financing, the technology to build the assets of the future that can generate the services we want in the modern economy without the emissions that are currently associated with the current asset base. But getting to net zero is so hard that it has forced global industries to transcend this model of sell more stuff, build more stuff, which of course is an attractive proposition, not just for disruptors of these industries, but increasingly for the incumbents. So if you look at steel, for example, the conversation now, which I think is very instructive for circular economy, is not just around how can we usher in the era of green steel, with hydrogen, and how can we manufacture more green steel that the world needs, but a recognition that we also need to focus on recycling of steel and material efficiency. And that actually all three of those basic strategies, greening primary steel production, recycling as much as we can, and reducing the underlying use of steel in new construction and other uses is important.
And what role do you think investors such as yourselves can play in this process? And am I right in thinking we're still at an early stage of what's likely to be a really comprehensive transformation?
Yes, I think we are. But the good news is that even in the last few years, we've seen the emergence of funds focused on the circular economy, including those managed by BlackRock. And we definitely see an opportunity to drive capital towards these solutions. I think if you're an investor who's focused on long-term value creation, and you live on a planet with finite resources, you have a vested interest in the circular economy.
Obviously, I'm a great supporter of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation being a trustee and not only believe in the idea of a circular economy, but trust also in the science I have seen. I wonder, though, if we are not talking bluntly enough about the risk of transitioning to circular models for the individual corporations. Of course, as an economy as a whole, the numbers add up, like you said, but that doesn't mean that for the individual company to reset their supply chain, to retrain their staff or even rehire where retraining is not realistic, those are significant investment risks. And it's not a given just because circular economy makes sense as a whole that it will work out for that individual company. So the question then for me is not whether the concept is plausible as a whole, but who finances the risk of that transition?
That's a really interesting and good question. And it's a conversation we've been having with companies for the last decade. I think everybody can see that the circular model can run in the long term and the linear can't. But there's the question of when do I jump? When I jump, how far do I jump? How much do I invest? Renault's been one of the companies we worked with right from the beginning. I remember them investing billions in EVs and everyone said, you're crazy, EVs aren't the future. Now look, I think it's easy to question change at the beginning, but very insightful to look back and see how quickly that change has actually really happened. So it's an interesting question. I think without question, there's a cost to a transition to a circular economy, but you have to weigh that up against the risk of staying with the linear economy. If linear doesn't work, then what does? It's circular. So how do you transition? You can't drop everything and be circular tomorrow because obviously your company won't have any income and it won't be able to function. So there's got to be that transition period. There is a cost to that, but you have to look in the long term. The investors have to understand that this is a longer term view. The investors have to realize that linear doesn't work in the long term, and there is that time when you have to move forwards. But with the incumbents, it takes time. If you're a big organization that's been running a linear system for many, many years, that'll take longer than a new startup that comes up with an amazing idea and, within a few years becomes $1 billion company. There are many examples of that. Seizing that opportunity and then making that happen. And I think the winners will be that mix of the incumbents who really take this on and those startups who grow incredibly quickly with an idea from nowhere because they don't have the baggage of that linear system around them.
And if we can turn to you, Audrey, and another related global challenge, plastic pollution. You spoke last year, I think, about the circular economy opportunity for investment banks. And I know this has been a focus for Morgan Stanley for a few years now, including with the plastic waste resolution. I'm just wondering, how have your discussions with clients on this topic evolved in the past rather eventful year? And how do you see progress in tackling plastics pollution?
Thanks so much, Judith. It has been actually a very fascinating evolution over the past couple of years. When we launched our plastic waste resolution, actually more than 2 years ago now, and we made a pledge that Morgan Stanley would facilitate the prevention, reduction, or removal of 50 million tons of plastic waste from ending up in nature. I think initially the reaction was, oh, that's really great. But there wasn't necessarily a complete understanding of why we as a global financial institution would be tackling plastic waste. I think very, early on, the more natural question is, isn't that something more for the chemical companies or the consumer packaging companies? And, the reason that we did it was we had this real conviction that because plastic is so permeated and woven through every single aspect of the economy and, all of our personal lives, we had to have sort of a full economy approach to it. And that meant every sector, including finance, as a major enabler across that. In fact, when we did a poll of investors, because through the Morgan Stanley Institute for Sustainable Investing, we're continually polling investors about their interests in sustainable investing. I'd say with respect to this topic, there's two very interesting trends I would highlight. One, we've seen an increasing trend in investors being more and more interested, not just in sustainable investing generally, but in very specific targeted themes. And when we ask them, what themes are you most interested, the very top three were climate change, plastic waste reduction, and circular economy. And I would just conclude by saying, I think that really resonates with a lot of things that Paul are saying, that increasingly, I think there's been a real shift of people not just seeing circular economy as something that in many people's minds invokes, ooh, that must mean less growth, right? If we're using stuff over and over again and we're producing less stuff, that must be less growth. People are now understanding that can actually be an incredibly compelling growth opportunity and therefore investment opportunity. So we've been very excited to see the progress there.
That's so interesting. And it sounds like the conversations with clients are sort of rapidly becoming increasingly sophisticated.
Absolutely. More sophisticated, more really trying to understand not only sort of what is the output, but really how does plastic waste reduction and a circular economy way of thinking become a part of the business value drivers of a corporation or of an investment strategy. And if you really, I think people are much more interested in things where companies are saying, we are going to rethink our design, rethink our supply chain, rethink our end of life capture, rather than saying we're going to host a lovely cleanup or we're going to write big checks towards some lovely cause. It's really about how do you use your business as a driver to create more value and also to create investment benefits of lower cost of materials, lower cost of waste, et cetera.